my name's Steve. I study rhetoric, and since you guys are all in a class with rhetoric in the title, yes, I wonder if you have a sense of what you think rhetoric is. So what I'd like you to do is wherever you're taking notes, whether you're doing it, 90s style or 21st century style or whatever you're doing, I don't want to know. It's good that you can't see the other side of the screen. Write down your definition of rhetoric. What do you think rhetoric is, or what do you think it means? Maybe you've had another rhetoric class. I don't know.
I really don't know much about it. This is the only rhetoric class at Cornell.
Is it? Oh, okay. That's sad.
No,
for reasons that we'll get into.
Rhetoric in the title.
Yeah, okay. But what do you think rhetoric means? What do you think it is? And we're going to kind of use this kind of as a grounding point to where you are right now. And then at the end of the talk, you might want to revisit it and think about what it might mean for you then. So I'll give you sort of a minute to think about that.
Sometimes it's mispronounced rhetoric.
No.
I said mispronounced.
Oh, mispronounced. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I thought you said
it's
pronounced.
It's not mispronounced? Yeah, it's mispronounced rhetoric. I can tell people who've been coming to class and they're like, I'm in your rhetoric of labor.
Right, yeah.
Like, you don't even say the name right. You haven't been showing up.
It's not really a popular word right now, is it? Do you hear it?
Rhetoric?
Yeah. You do? Where do you hear it?
Like, we talk about political rhetoric.
Political rhetoric? Yeah. Like in the news, stuff like that, television. Where else do you hear anywhere else? Mostly political, right?
Or English, like writing classes.
Yeah, writing classes. In fact, in the English department, you might have people who say, I study rhetoric. What does it mean that they study? For a lot of them, they study writing, is what they mean. Right? But it's all related. It's all related. So, does anybody want to share what they've come up with? I won't embarrass you or anything like that. My years of study say you're absolutely wrong. No, I'm not going to do that. Go ahead.
I said rhetoric is how you frame your mode of communication.
Okay. How you frame your mode of communication. That's kind of cool. Yeah.
I said the art of expressing words and concepts.
Okay. The art of expressing words, concepts. Yeah.
All of that, but as it involves persuasion as well.
Persuasion. Do you think rhetoric has to involve persuasion or no?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah? How many say yes? How many say no? Okay, the people who said yes persuade the other people. No, I'm just kidding. Who else wants to share their idea? Yeah, you.
Is it the human use of symbols to communicate?
Now, where did you get that from? I know where you got that from, but let's see if you know where you got that from.
From the textbook.
From a textbook by?
By Foss. What's
It's 3 authors.
Yeah. Foss. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
which
we
book?
actually have the book that's just written by Foss.
Oh, okay. Because that's the famous definition of Foss, and trap.
Yeah.
The uniquely human ability to use symbols to communicate.
And Foss is now, Sonia Foss is now broken off from her sister and Robert Trapp and just wrote her own damn book.
They all have indie projects, but the band is not done. It's like, that's like, she's just like, I got this indie project. They don't really sound like Foss, and trap songs. It's okay. Yeah, that's a pretty good definition. It's good you're reading the book. That's really, you're like, that's great. It's like a professor's dream. Anybody else want to share theirs? That's fine. Maybe at the end you might want to share yours, or maybe you could say how you've changed yours. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk to you about what rhetoric can be. It's hard to nail it down, but I'm going to provide you 3 different ways that rhetoric has been thought of in the most general sense I can, as sort of an introduction for this class you're getting into. And I hope that these 3 ways that I present rhetoric to you become useful for you over the course of the semester to kind of make sense of what you're doing, and to make sense of what you're reading, and to make sense of what you're putting together, because these are perspectives. It's sort of like, going and looking at art, and you stand and look at the painting one way, you get one sense of it, you stand and look at it another way, or like sculpture, you can walk all around it, see it different ways. That's kind of what tonight's about. I don't want you to think that these are the only 3 ways that people have thought about rhetoric, and I certainly don't want you to think that these are exclusive, or that you have to pick one. There are 3 perspectives that I'm going to share with you tonight. 3 cases. The first case is the case that rhetoric is all about persuasion and moving people's minds and hearts with your words. That's the first case, the first argument that I'm going to make about what rhetoric is for you here tonight. The second is the case that rhetoric is a critical tool for understanding how people decide what things mean how to understand speech as an art form, how to understand what people have made reality out of. And it starts with this gentleman here, who we'll talk about halfway through. And the third is the case that rhetoric is a set of tools or a human ability to make reality. It's how we make meaning together out of just about anything that we see. So there's a historical trajectory here, as you can tell through these images. But it's not necessarily a historical story. I'm going to tell it in a historical way, but that's a rhetorical choice I'm making. I can present this to you in any kind of way, and at the end, I'll talk to you about another way you can approach rhetoric that's not necessarily the temporal, narrative, this came first, then this kind of sense. Because I don't want you to get it wrong. Any of these things, they didn't happen because of the time period that they happened. They happened because people were thinking, and they were exposed to different things that made them think. So let's get into the first one that we'll talk about in detail. Here are the questions that I think we're going to talk about. And I think you should talk about when you're thinking about a rhetoric definition yourself. What can we do with rhetoric? What's it good for? Why have it at all? What can we not do with rhetoric? What are its limitations? What are the things that are outside of rhetoric? And that's something we can talk about at the end of the lecture, of what things you think rhetoric might not be useful for. And the spectrum among scholars really goes pretty far as what it can be, what it is, what it can't be, all that stuff. And then what counts as rhetoric under your definition and what doesn't. So whatever definition you have is going to include, it's going to suggest a political realm for rhetoric, and it's going to exclude and say what rhetoric doesn't do or what rhetoric's not about. So however you frame it, it's going to leave things out and leave things in. There's no right or wrong, but it's going to constitute a political. And by political, I mean a small p political. That is, what can we do? What should we do? What ought we do? What's available to human beings in the terms of rhetoric as a conception. So, this guy here, does anybody know who this is? It's not your grandpa. Who is it?
Aristotle.
Aristotle, yes. You recognize him from all of his photos. No, I don't know. I mean, nobody really knows. I mean, this is like a bust of him, but I don't know where it's from, but this is supposedly what he looked like. Aristotle is probably the most significant person that we look to when we're thinking about the first case of rhetoric. The first case of rhetoric being the question of persuasion. That rhetoric is about persuading people, that rhetoric is about things like arguing, that rhetoric is about things like using your speech to move people. And Aristotle represents kind of the culmination of a very long, drawn-out political debate in where he lived, which was ancient Athens. And we can talk a little bit about ancient Athens. Is there history? I guess you guys are you guys from majors all over, or are you all industrial labor relations
There's
people?
like 4 people that aren't industrial labor relations majors.
Well, maybe some of you know a little bit about ancient history, and you can share your thoughts about Athens in a minute and what it was like there to constitute this. But Aristotle's the person I want you to think about when you think about this understanding of rhetoric as persuasion, because he wrote the book on it, one of the first books that we have on it, which is called On Rhetoric. You can get it for like $2 or $3 in any used bookstore here in Ithaca or wherever you'd like to shop for books, I don't know. It's everywhere. It's been translated a bunch of times. And that is his book that says, here's how you do rhetoric. Here's how you make speeches to get people to believe you and to take actions that you think they should take. But he also wrote a bunch of other books. Has anybody read anything else Aristotle wrote? I weep for the future. No, I'm just kidding. It's fine. There's no reason you should have read any Aristotle. But he's called the first scientist. A lot of people call Aristotle the first scientist. And the reason why is because he was one of the very first people to sort of take a step back and say, I'm going to try to look at things objectively and just enumerate their parts. So when you read Aristotle, he makes a lot of lists. In fact, you guys are probably better suited for reading Aristotle than I was when I was young, because when I was young, we didn't have something that really helps you understand Aristotle, and that's BuzzFeed. You guys use BuzzFeed? So it's like 14 things you didn't know about plants. Number 7 will really surprise you. That's how Aristotle writes. So if you read On Plants, it quite literally reads like this. It's like, here are the 5 parts of the plant. And of the first part, there are 3 parts. It's just like list making. And he's categorizing it all out. So on plants, on animals. He also wrote politics. He also wrote 2 books on ethics. and he wrote about physics, and then there was a text that came after his book on physics, which in Greek is just titled Metaphysike, right? Metaphysics, which is a whole discipline in philosophy. And it's just the thing after physics is exhausted. What else can we say about the universe? And that's the birth of metaphysics. So Aristotle was responsible for a lot of things. And he was a teacher, and most of what he wrote is not very exhaustive. It's like lists. So a lot of people think that what Aristotle wrote were notes for him to lecture from. Things that he had written to help jog his memory for interacting with his students. And he taught at a school called the Academy that his teacher founded. His teacher was a guy by the name of Plato. We'll talk about in a second. But when you think about Aristotle's contribution to rhetoric, here is the definition that he provided. This is his definition of rhetoric. The art of identifying all available means of persuasion in a given instance. And I'll leave it up there for a second so you can write it down if you want to. But I want you to think about what that might mean, and maybe you could like reword it in a way. Does anybody want to try to reword it? What do you think he's getting at there? Or what stands out to you about that definition that you think is interesting or odd or... Yeah.
I think definitely if you think of rhetoric in the sense that it's like in service of persuasion, it's like what the tactics are, but he's saying it's the art of identifying like what the different tactics are that you can employ.
Yeah, very nice. He's saying it's about identifying, not using. I think that's an important thing to think. And there's some reasons that that might be the case that I'll get to in a second. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was basically just going to say the same thing. Honestly, the quote seems more like a quote about intellect and identifying, what you can do instead of just rhetoric and what you should do. Yeah, I was going to say something.
Yeah, I think he's sort of, remember he's called the first scientist, right? So he's sort of laying out, here's what it is, here's what it looks like, here are the elements of it, here's how it works, here's the things. And the rhetoric is, if you ever want to read it, I mean, actually you can get it for free. If you Google Aristotle's rhetoric, you can just read it on the web for free. I'm pretty sure it's so old that not only does he have no relatives for the copyright, but the people who translated it in the 19th century are also long gone. So I think there's free copies all over the internet. You can just read it. And it's in 3 sections. And one is defining rhetoric. The second is about audiences, which is a really masterful discussion of what motivates people. Like if your audience is primarily old, here's what they're interested in. If they're primarily young, here's what they're interested in. If they work, here's what they're interested in. If they don't work, if they're wealthy, here's what they're interested in. And he goes down the line, down the line, down the line. And it's this the very first comprehensive sort of audience psychology ever written. It was a very long time ago.
One of the sections that the student groups present is about neoclassical rhetoric.
Yeah.
And I had a group of students that are like, let's bring in a copy of the rhetoric, not realizing that really old copy would be very valuable and probably non-existent. It's not.
Yeah.
It's on papyrus or something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but Cornell does have a copy that was published in the 1400s.
Yeah.
So well, not really published, just kind of written.
Yeah, it's an incredibly old book. It was probably copied and copied. And a lot of these things were copied and brought over through Arabic culture, through the Muslim world, and then recopied and then brought back to the Western world. So it was Greek, and then it went to Arabic, then back. So it's been all over the place and translated so many times. It's very, very old. But what circulates even more than his book, Rhetoric, is he was very, very famous for something else. I don't know if you guys know. But Aristotle wrote all these books. He's the first scientist. But he was also famous as a teacher. Does anybody know who his most famous student was?
Socrates.
Not Socrates was Socrates was Plato's teacher, so he's like his grandpa teacher. Is that a category of person you can be? Like his teacher's teacher, is that your grandpa teacher? I don't know. We're making up new weird categories of relationships here tonight. But yeah, he was his teacher's teacher. And Aristotle was too young to have known Socrates, but Socrates was a very well-known figure to the Athenians, a popular figure.
Didn't you teach Alexander the Great?
That's right. And what is Alexander the Great known for? Besides being great. I had some student, he's like, he was great. I'm like, That's like one time I was teaching and I was like, what does the word sublime mean? If something is sublime, what is it? And somebody's like, beneath the lime. It sounds clever at first. What's sublime? Anything under the lime. My margarita. Yeah. Alexander the Great, what was he known for? Yeah.
Dying from malaria or something like that.
He was Alexander the Great because he was the greatest person. He died from malaria so awesomely that we call him Alexander the Great. No.
Conquering like three-fourths of the world.
Yeah, conquering the known world. Conquering the known world. So Alexander the Great was a Macedonian royalty, and his father, King Philip, hired Aristotle to be his personal teacher for his son to make sure that he would be an amazing king, amazing ruler. And there's a document that circulates, and you can find this on the internet too, called Rhetoric to Alexander. And it's supposedly a transcript of Aristotle teaching Alexander the Great about persuasion and how to get people to do what you want without threatening them and their family with an army of sword-wielding maniacs, which is like the #1 way to probably get people to do what you want if you're the commander of an enormous military and you're conquering the world and all that. But it circulated quite a bit, and you can read that. A lot of people don't think it's authentic. They think it was a commentator on rhetoric writing a kind of an exercise, creative writing exercise, /dot or something about, you know, what's happening between these two. But people debate about that, talk about that in classical rhetoric. But Aristotle, his definition of rhetoric comes out of a particular historical and social situation, which is what was going on in ancient Athens at the time that he was alive. So some of the people here we have mentioned Socrates, and we've mentioned Plato. Plato was Aristotle's teacher, and Socrates was Plato's teacher. In Athens, I'll back it up here. In Athens at this time, what can you tell me about ancient Athens? What kind of things do you know about ancient Athens that you could, from high school history, maybe a history class you had here at Cornell? Yeah.
It was a republic.
It was a republic. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, there was some degree of debate and voting instilled into what policies were made, even though there was, I think there still was an autocrat in place. Like there still was a Caesar, but
yeah, they didn't call him a Caesar. They didn't know about that yet.
yeah, the citizens had some degree of policy making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a person in charge called the Archon, which is, I think, a cooler thing to be called than president. I'm the Archon. There's a person who's in charge of Athens, is sort of elected into this office. And they were a democracy. So any citizen could go and directly debate on whatever the policy was going to be. But who counted as a citizen in ancient Athens?
It's like white old men.
Property,
Right?
Property owners, that's the most important thing to ancient Athens, is the line of your property, because that's how you get all your rights. It's not about birthright citizenship, it's about where your family can trace your property and your landed wealth. What property you own in the city. So that's a very, very important thing to know about ancient Athens. Everyone could just go and debate. They didn't have like professional politicians. You would just go and debate. If you were an Athenian man, you could go and participate in these debates. But if you're an Athenian woman, you could not. Nor could you vote. Nor could you really even leave your house without a male escort. Either you're an older brother, your father, your husband. It was a lot like Iran today, if you think about in terms of what can women do. Or like Saudi Arabia, what can women do? Ancient Athens was a lot like that for women, which is really, really odd to think about since we attribute to them so much about freedom and democracy and debate and all these kind of things. Very odd kind of situation. But, I mean, the way we do things and what we think, who we think have rights and stuff is odd to somebody else. It's the way of the world. The other interesting thing about ancient Athens is it had a very developed legal system, but no lawyers. So if I accused you of a crime, there's a punishment on the books. It's probably death or something horrible will happen to you. You have to come to the court and defend yourself and give a speech to the jury. The jury is usually 301 or 501 people. And the way they vote is they give them a white rock and a black rock, and you throw whichever rock you think into the bin at the end to vote, and then they count it out and see whether you're acquitted or whether you'll be condemned. And the way they timed the speeches was with a thing called the water clock, which is like those big jugs they use in football practice, you know, those big water jugs, and they would just like uncork it, and while the water's running and you can hear it, you're allowed to speak. And as it starts to slow down, you're running out of time. So in a lot of the old documents where people are recording these speeches, people are like, I can hear the water failing, I can hear the drips, let me wrap up what I'm saying. Because they're referring to the water clock. Because they can hear it kind of like the stream starting to lose power, so they know they need to wrap up their speech. Kind of cool that they're referring to it in their speeches as part of the art of persuading. And now as the final drips happen, let me remind you of my great service to the city, this kind of thing. It's cool to go look at these old documents and be like, and now you kind of know how to read them. So now you know a little bit about ancient Athens. But the most important thing to know is that the fact that not everybody is good. How many of you would feel confident defending yourself in front of a group of 500 people to decide whether you go to prison or not? Could you give a speech that would get you off, do you think? Yeah, I mean, I don't think so either. Maybe, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm a professional, and I don't know if I would still want a lawyer to be like, hey, what do we do? And the lawyer's like, calm down, it's okay. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. It's cool, I got you. So a class of people came in to fill this role, and there were people like Gorgias here. People who are called the sophists. I don't know if you've ever heard this word before. Yeah, the sophist? What's a sophist?
Oh, I have a friend named Sophia who likes to
Sophia.
talk about how her name is wisdom.
That's right. Her name in ancient Greek does mean wisdom, Sophia, or sophos, wise. A wise person, sophos. Just like the word rhetoric is an ancient Greek word. Rhetoros means a speaker, an orator. That's all it means. It's Plato who changes rhetoric from something that a person is into a thing or an object of study when he changes it from the Greek, the person rhetoros, to rhetorike, which is an interesting change. Nobody has done that before. Plato did that. He's like in the dialogue Gorgias, where he has Socrates argue against Gorgias about should people be taught rhetoric? Is this good for society? He says, what is the thing you teach? What is this rhetoric, rhetorike, making it a noun, making it a thing, which is the first time it's happened that we know of in the recorded Greek language. And they have a big debate about that. You can read the Gorgias and see what you think, but there's no bigger figure than Gorgias in terms of the sophists, who are people who came to Athens and said, if you want to speak better, and if you want to make people do what you think is good, pay me and I'll show you how to do it. They were all foreigners. They all came from different places in the ancient world. They all spoke great Greek, and they were all incredibly charming, really, really, really magnanimous, wonderful people who you would want to be buddies with. And they all had kind of a shtick, right? Gorgias was the most famous, I think, of all of them. He was like the Elvis. Or like, I'm trying to think of like the biggest hip-hop star you can imagine. And that's who Gorgias was. Because Gorgias would come to Athens and he's like, I'm going to do a concert. I'm going to read The Birds, some old poem. And he would read it in this rhythmic way. And he was from, I think he's from Syracuse, I think. Not the Syracuse down the road, but, you know, Italian Syracuse. And he had this cool accent everybody really liked when he spoke Greek. And so he'd come and read these poems at this rhythm, and very much like a contemporary hip-hop concert, everybody would, you know, bounce along with it, right? And this kind of horrified Socrates and horrified Plato, because when you're doing that, you're not listening to what the person is saying, you're just moving along with it, and you might be accepting things that you're not critically assessing. And Gorgias was very much aware of his power and his art when he gave his incredibly famous speech, which you can read on the internet, Encomium Tallinn. You guys know who Helen was? Who's Helen? What's she known for? Big, great Athenian hero, right?
Helen of Troy.
Yeah.
She's started the war from the Iliad, right?
Yeah. And the war in the Iliad was like good for Greece or bad?
Really bad history. I assume bad.
Yeah.
War.
Nobody's naming their daughter Helen in Athens, okay? Like not, Helen's not, she's thought of as like a horrible, like slutty, terrible, everything bad about other woman could be, right? Because she's married to Menelaus, who's a Greek king. She goes off with Paris of Troy and goes over there and starts this 15-year war that claims all these heroes. Even the gods get involved. It's like this terrible disaster. Odysseus, it takes him like 20 years to get home. It's like a nightmare. And it's all Helen's fault. Right? It's this incredible belief that they have. So an encomium is a speech of high praise that you give to a hero. So Gorgias was like, my new mixtape drops on Tuesday. It's called Encomium to Helen. Check it out. And people are like, how is he going to praise Helen? That's impossible. But he does it. He does a really good job of it. I don't have the time to go into the details here. That's like a whole other lecture itself about why that speech is so good. But at the end of it, he stops and he's like, okay, why did I do this? Because I can. Because I have the power to make almost anything reasonable and believable. I don't really believe this, but I'll tell you what I do believe in. I believe in rhetoric. I believe in the power of words. For me, rhetoric is like everything to me. It is my pharmakon. That's the ancient Greek word he uses, right? Pharmakon. There's an English word that we get from pharmakon, yeah? Does anybody guess? Pharmacy?
Yeah.
And what do you get at the pharmacy? drugs, right? So, pharmakon means drug. So speech is my drug. Rhetoric is my drug. And I can do anything with it. So come study with me. And this was like the blow-up hit of the summer. Everybody's jamming to Encomium Tallinn, right? Amazing. So Plato likes this guy Socrates, who is not considered by many people to be a sophist, but to argue against them, to say, what is it that you're really about? What is the thing that you stand for? What's your belief? What do you stand for? What do you really believe in? Because Socrates' belief was that exposing what was inside or was in the soul is the thing that we should be attending to, not making people believe different things with words. And the sophists didn't believe that. The sophists said it's about getting people to see different perspectives on things. So here we have sort of the classical debate about where truth comes from, right? And you guys are like, oh God, philosophy. Here we go. Like these crazy philosophical debates that keep you up until 3 in the morning. Well, the important thing to know is the political ramifications of this, because Gorgias became really well known, very wealthy, along with the other sophists, and Socrates was put to death for what he was doing. Corrupting the youth, right? Questioning everything, incredible cynicism, incredible skepticism. He was charged with telling young people, like Plato, that maybe we should question the existence of the gods. Stuff like that. So, after Socrates is killed by the state of Athens, Plato writes his dialogues, which are all against the sophists. All of them against the sophists, saying no one should be taught these skills ever. In fact, they're not skills. They destroy democracy. They destroy truth-seeking. They destroy all of that. The sophists responded by saying, that's a very interesting take on our art, is teaching people that unique way to speak to where they think they've actually accessed the truth. That's cool. You do your thing, we'll do our thing. So the sophists had this very sort of postmodern approach to information, truth, and all that. And they said humans are very limited. We can't know everything, but what we can do is try to show people different ways of looking at something. And that is where the power of the human perspective lies. And the sophists get a really bad rap. In fact, you might hear the word sophistry as a way to describe tricky speech. And we get that because Plato won this fight. We read all of Plato's stuff, we don't read any of the sophist stuff. And very little of the sophist stuff is actually preserved, quite honestly. We have almost all of Plato's writings, we have very little of the sophists. But this is not a talk about classical rhetoric, although I will give you Gorgias' quote from Encomium Tallinn, which is, I think, kind of his definition of rhetoric, is that it is an incredible power that we have to bring up feelings in people out of almost nothing. I don't know if you were feeling pleasure or intrigue or curiosity when I told you the tale of Gorgias and his speech and all of that. But this is an example of what Gorgias would say is cool about rhetoric. Is here we are in this really boring-ass classroom, Cornell University, 7:30 p.m. or wherever we are, Ithaca, New York, and you were like there. You're like thinking about it, you're like, wow, what would people think? That kind of thing. So, this is a quote from that about what he thinks it is. So going back to Aristotle, we can say two things about what he thought rhetoric was. It's a productive art. And this is something that's still debated in rhetoric. Is rhetoric a critical tool for analysis, or is it a productive art? Is it something that we use to teach people how to make, or is it something we teach people how to criticize with? And I'm pretty, well, I won't tell you my thoughts until the end if you want to know where I stand on all this. But I'll keep it neutral for now. And it's a creative thing. Aristotle's clearly about it's creative and it's about production. It's about giving people the tools to go into a political discussion with limited time and limited resources and figure out how to make people see what's the right thing to do. It's about political pragmatism. And Socrates and Plato were like, no, this isn't good to teach people at all. That's something people can just figure out. What we need to teach people is to spend as much time, all their time, trying to figure out what really is the beautiful, what really is the right thing to do, what really is the ethical. And the other Athenians are like, oh, the Spartans are like coming, right? The Persians are coming. We have to figure out what to do. How many boats should we build? Who should pay for them? All this kind of stuff. And that had to be debated out. So Aristotle was like, it has a lot of value. It has a lot of value. So he settled it by saying, philosophy is good for some things, rhetoric is good for other things. That's kind of how he settled it. Okay. This understanding of rhetoric travels through time. And I'll give you sort of thousands of years of history very quickly. Cicero, Roman attorney, Roman statesman, consul, had one of the highest offices you can have. He studied rhetoric and wrote about rhetoric too. In his famous book on rhetoric, De Oratore, or The Orator, or Oratory, you can still get today and read. There's a chapter on jokes that doesn't make any sense because we don't understand why Latin jokes are funny. We can translate them, but they don't make, it's funny to read. You actually should go and read the chapter on jokes because it's full of footnotes. And all the footnotes are the translators saying, look, I'm not an idiot. This is the accurate translation. It just doesn't make any sense. You know, it's like all these funny jokes and things that they thought were really funny, but we don't get. I don't know why.
I'll tell them.
You want me to stop the
Are you guys
camera?
ready? Vita est supplicum. Life is punishment. This was a
That's not funny, Sam. Oh wait, no, that's the point.
Cicero, and has anybody ever heard of a place called Cicero, New York? You have. It's by Syracuse. And Cicero had a nickname. And do you know what his nickname was?
I do.
Steve knows. Does anybody know what his nickname was?
Tully.
Tully, yeah. How do you know that?
You told us last week.
Oh.
You should have hidden that. See, the sophist, the good rhetorician would be like, well, I think everyone knows that.
Because there was this classic
You would've never
scholar in
known.
the map office, and he just went crazy and named everybody after Roman and Greek.
Yeah, a lot of people, this is a good point Sam makes, because a lot of people say, American government, democracy, republic, what do we have? And a lot of people say, well, we're a democracy like the ancient Athenians. But when you look to the record, there's a lot of evidence that we're a republic the way the Romans imagined their state to be. And one of the most compelling pieces of this is all of our founding fathers were very, 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 very impressed by someone who they called Tully, which is Cicero. So like John Adams, president, John Quincy Adams, president, they lecture on rhetoric. Thomas Jefferson writes about rhetoric, George Washington, and they're all talking about Tully as an incredibly influential person about what the republic ought to be and what governance ought to be. In fact, they all imagine themselves as Romans. Right? George Washington famously compared himself many times to Cincinnatus, who was the person called upon to be the dictator of Rome during wartime, and had all the powers. They dissolved all the constitutional checks on the authority of the executive. And then after the war, they're like, you know, Emperor Cincinnatus, what do we do now? And he's like, let's establish a Senate. Let's establish voting. Let's establish laws to check executive power. But he didn't have to. I think Nelson has probably already seen this too many times. Yeah. He's like, this is a rerun. I'm out. Yeah. Cincinnatus didn't have to do that. There was no one who could have stopped him. He had all the power. But he liked the idea of Republican Rome so much, that's why he became emperor, to defend it. And then he returned to his farm to plow his fields. He was the most powerful man on earth for a few years, and then returned Republican governance back to Rome, and then went back to being a farmer.
And
super romantic, right?
No.
George Washington was like, that's why I should only be president for 2 terms. And people like Alexander Hamilton thought the president should serve for life on good behavior. But Hamilton was a big admirer of royal forms of government and stuff. Not the biggest Democrat you could, you could draw up,
another bit of trivia, town not very far from here, called Cincinnatus.
Yeah, Cincinnatus, right? And that's probably more from like Washington's letters and public statements than anything else. Right? And the love of ancient Rome and all these figures and how they played in. Cicero always talked about rhetoric as being something that, he wrote a book about it called Invention when he was 19 years old. We still read this book today. When he got older, he was like, no, I was too young. I didn't really know much about it. But in Roman rhetoric, they had lawyers and they had attorneys, and Roman rhetoric is a different thing than sort of the Athenian sophistic rhetoric. It's like, how can we generate the idea of a good person speaking in defense of the republic? What does a good statesman look like? And we get a lot of this in our government too. Like, what does it mean to be presidential? A lot of people are talking about this with Donald Trump these days, yes? Does a president really tweet at 3 in the morning about Project Runway? Is this a good person behaving in a stately way? I mean, these are the debates we're having. Not so different than the debates Romans are having in their time about what does it look like to be a good figure of the state. So this is where rhetoric starts to become about what do you symbolize, what do you perform. Not just about persuasive words, but what do you look like. Coming after him was Quintilian. Quintilian had a really cool hat and some like leaves or something. I don't know. This is the only picture I could find.
Yeah.
I don't know if he looked like
Pretty
this.
bizarre.
But yeah, Quintilian was cool because he was like a modern academic. Quintilian lived on the opposite end of the Roman Empire from Cicero. He lived in the late Roman Empire. And the emperor, this is when it was an empire, not a republic anymore, big difference. And the emperor Vespasian said, the reason why the empire is not good and people aren't getting good jobs and our economy is bad is that we need to make Rome great again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give huge grants to people to come up with ways to bring back the Senate. And Quintilian's like, well, I'm a speech teacher. I'll write a book series about how to take your little kid and make them like the best senator in Roman history over the course of their life. And he's like, do it, here's some money. So a 14-volume book called Institutes of Oratory. And in that, we get the idea of rhetoric as the good man speaking well. He also had all these cool, Quintilian had all these cool quotes like, anytime you speak before an audience of people who are part of the Republic, speak as if there was a Roman legion right behind you. Speak with that, and you'll always get them to listen to you. That's like a real nice trick for confidence, right? If you have like the most powerful, most equipped, most technologically advanced army in the world right behind you, I mean, people are going to listen to you, right? But Quintilian was an immigrant. Quintilian was not Roman Latin. He wasn't Italian. He was Spanish. And he spoke with an accent, and so all these things are really, really important to him. So reading him as an immigrant talking about how to be persuasive to people who have a real strong sense of native identity connected with their politics is kind of timely today, I would say.
I like how you said, make Rome great again.
Yeah. It's good. Somebody should use that.
Someone should make a hat.
Yeah, somebody should make a hat, and yeah, absolutely. Actually, I saw a hat the other day. It said, I don't know what your politics are, but I thought this was funny. It said, make wearing red hats acceptable again.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty, like it's really kind of gone the gamut of rhetorical, like sort of, memes are really great because it's like watching a snake eat itself.
Yeah.
It's like they collapse into the point of, so like in Ithaca is a great example of that because you have that shirt, Ithaca is gorgeous. And then people, the literalists were like, I don't like that silly poetic wordplay. So they make sure it's Ithaca is cold. Right, and then the surrealists and postmodernists come and Ithaca is your mom. Like I've seen all these shirts, right? And so it's like, nobody can find any of the statements acceptable. They have to continuously one-up each other with like, you're so far away from meaning, let me show you how far away from meaning you are. Which is like, you could do a rhetorical study on these Ithaca shirts,
I
I
was
swear
in
to God.
Ithaca the other day and I saw someone with one of those red hats and it just said, WTF America.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I had a student do a rhetorical analysis of all the different hat variants. And I think my favorite one was, make Metallica good again. Which I think is like, gosh, why did they just suddenly decide to like hit Metallica in the middle of all this? Like, poor James Hetfield, that, just like out of the blue, attacked in the middle of the Trump debate. No, well. Anyway, Quintilian is really cool. So reading his stuff and thinking about his experience as a Spanish immigrant is kind of cool. St. Augustine I put up here because this is like, St. Augustine the Badass. This is like an action movie, like heroic, like, this is like the picture I wish I could find for Quintilian. Because St. Augustine's not as cool as Quintilian. But St. Augustine is important because as a Catholic bishop and a bishop stationed in a Catholic leader of the Catholic Church stationed in pagan territory that used to be Greek city-states, like North Africa and places like that, he encountered Aristotle and basically that was his only rhetoric book, and he said, hey, we should be using these principles as the church to bring people into the church. We shouldn't be saying, you're going to burn in fire forever if you don't do what I say. That's not going to persuade people. Like, we need to persuade people. So he was the person who advocated using rhetoric to try to get people to actually see things your way. It was because of Aristotle that he accessed that stuff. And then Francis Bacon, he had so each one of these people have their own definition of rhetoric. So Cicero's understanding of rhetoric is who is the good person who can represent the state sort of the best. Quintilian's is the good man speaking well. St. Augustine said rhetoric has 3 offices. 3 things it can do. It can teach, it can please, and it can move people. That's all it is. It's not mind control. It's not the absence of having a good soul or a good heart. It's none of that stuff. What it is it just teaches, it pleases, and moves. So from the Augustinian perspective, any class you're in is a rhetorical event. And that, based on your definition of rhetoric, you came up at the beginning of the talk, you might say, wow, that's kind of interesting. I never thought of my classes as persuasive. But in a sense, they really are. There's continuous persuasion. Your professor's constantly trying to get you to think of themselves as an expert, constantly trying to get you to think of what they're saying is vital and important, trying to get you to see the value of why you have to take this class or why the class matters in the scope of what you're doing. So in a sense, they are persuasive events, and that opens up all of teaching to the study of rhetoric, or that rhetorical theory and rhetorical principles could apply to even something like teaching. So it's kind of a powerful,
What were the 3 things again for
to
sound?
teach, to please, and to move. That's St. Augustine,
That could be on the test.
the badass hero of whatever action movie this is. Some like Dan Brown thing it looks like, I don't know. Francis Bacon, famous British scientist, famous for lots of things, but not for inventing bacon, which I know Sam is going to say back there. But Francis
Love
Bacon,
BLT.
he was a writer. He's a big part of the scientific revolution, and he said that rhetoric was applying reason to the imagination for the better moving of the will. I think it's kind of a cool definition. Applying reasons to the imagination for the better moving of the will. So it's like Francis Bacon's like the first advertising guru, right? That's like a TV commercial, right? Applying reasons to the imagination for the better moving of the will. So it's like, imagine you're in this situation. Oh, look, here's some reasons why this situation is better because of this product. Go buy it. Let me move your will to go buy it, right? That's the way to remember that one. Think about that one. So that's what he said the definition of rhetoric was. But all this, all these people are informed primarily by Aristotle. They didn't really have access to the sophists. They didn't have access to much past Plato. So Socrates is thought of as a historical person, not as a construction Plato using a famous figure to say his politics or anything like that. Which is kind of the way we think about Platonic dialogues today. Okay, now we come to the bad guys in the story. Everything's going fine. Rhetoric's being studied all over the place. And it comes into the 1600s where we get a lot of changes. One of them is the Enlightenment. The change in thinking to a much more hard scientific perspective like we have today. We're still sort of laboring under the ideology of the Enlightenment. That science can provide us all the answers, just give them enough time, they will solve all the mysteries, we'll know everything, and one day it'll stop and we'll have everything. Everything will be revealed, right? And this is popularized by certain public figures like Neil deGrasse Tyson and people like that. They're like, without science you're nothing. This all comes from a big revolution in thought that happens around the 17th century. And there'll be another one and another one and another one, right?
And
So,
you represent it with Darth Vader?
I do, because I'm a rhetorician and I like rhetoric. And so this is the decline of rhetoric, is the person who I think we can think of in the history of rhetoric as Darth Vader, as the person who was trained in rhetoric and then turned against and killed all the baby rhetoricians. We remember that scene. Killed all the little baby rhetoricians in the little rhetorician training tower and ruined all the good. Is this guy, Peter Ramus, there he is, who was a French teacher, and he wrote a book about rhetoric. It was actually his dissertation about Quintilian. And he basically sort of said in his work that rhetoric, the best rhetoric would be to have no rhetoric at all. In fact, it would be better if we just knew things and we didn't have to dispute them. And we just didn't have to worry about persuading people, things like that. We see this in modern books where, you know, if you go to like the business section of any modern bookstore, you can kind of see this dream alive. It's like 10 tips for a successful business presentation. It's like, man, if I just do these things, people would just listen to me. It's really hard work to get people to listen to you and believe you and to convince people. It's much easier to trick them, or it's much easier to present them an edited list of things you call facts. And you push it, like just earlier, one of my students is talking to me here on Facebook about, oh, my sister called me. My whole family is getting destroyed by hurricanes. My sister lives in Houston. My dad lives outside of Tampa. So it's like everybody's getting crushed. It's not good. But my student earlier is taking political science class where she says that her professor said that evidence is facts. Because like, what is evidence? And she said, evidence is the constitution of information under limited conditions to be believable, which is what a fact is. Like if you go back and look at Renaissance books about your field, whatever it might be, science, whatever, they're incomprehensible. The best works of like the Renaissance period or any earlier period are not comprehensible. Why? Because they have a different understanding of what a fact is from you. You've been through the Enlightenment. You've been through the 20th century debates on epistemology. You don't know that you've been through them, but you're born into a world where all these things are happening. So what counts as a fact for you is very different than somebody who lived 100 years ago. It's always constituted. You always have to get audience agreement as to what a fact is. So when people say, it's a new era, we're in the post-fact era. No, we've always been in the post-fact era from the perspective of rhetoric. Always, always, always. You always have to constitute it. You always have to say, here are the facts. You always have to do it in a recognizable way. Information isn't neutral. Information is a political category that we construct. I'm getting ahead of myself. Peter Ramus didn't say any of these things. He just said, rhetoric is not really the source of truth, it's philosophy. He's sort of turning back towards Plato. And rhetoric is how we get those truths out to people. So rhetoric becomes sort of the ornamentation, the accoutrement to the truths found elsewhere. But even today, this is sort of, this Ramus thing is still happening where, you know, political science professors saying facts are evidence. Not the case. Not the case. Evidence in a case about, in the, I don't know, the county seat of like land management is very different than what counts as evidence in a criminal trial. It's very different than what counts as evidence about who you should vote for. Evidence is not evidence is not evidence. It has nothing to do with facts at all. It's what's convincing to you as accurate, valuable information. And that's always socially constructed, I would say. So, but he and people like him want to have it to where there's no real rhetoric like as a source of information or truth or
Could you
facts.
back up just to Ramus for a second? How did he die?
He was grading papers in his office. He's a teacher, he's a professor. And his angry students, as part of an angry mob, there was a big riot going on. He was killed in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in French history. So they thought he was of one disposition. I don't remember what they thought he was, whether they thought he was Catholic or Protestant. And his students angrily charged up the stairs into his office, picked him up and threw him out of his window. And killed him.
Don't get any ideas.
Because he was the wrong religion, they thought. I mean, this is why, this is the story I told when they're like, why haven't you graded my papers yet? I'm like, I don't grade because of the story. I don't want to be caught. I don't want to be caught by surprise. I don't grade anything. Grade yourselves. I don't want to be caught in my office and thrown out the window. Luckily, my office is on the ground floor. So I think I'd just get a little dirty.
Mine's on the 6th.
Yeah. Be careful, Sam. Don't grade anything. Just give them all A's.
They would like that.
Yeah, I think they might. So this leads to the next change in sort of rhetorical history. And then we're going to get up to some of the more interesting stuff. I know this like ancient history is not maybe the most exciting thing. Elocution. The elocutionary movement was what rhetoric became in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, which is about how do you stand, how do you gesture, how do you pronounce things correctly, how do you change the tone of your voice to make people feel sad or excited or angry. It's all about presentation. And here's a great photo of elocution sort of being taught here about embouchure and jawline. If you look at old speech books, this is from a book I actually own, which is a book, a public speaking book from the 19th century. And these are all the things that we'd be doing in speech class to get you ready to make a good speech, which is like how to gesture in ways that communicate things to people. This actually kind of carries over in a weird little subset of psychology called neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP. I know Sam's heard of this. But neuro-linguistic programming is based on the work of B.F. Skinner. And the idea that you have to be persuaded of first is that we are primarily biological and neurological organisms. If you buy that, as that's our primary what we are, and we're little percentages of other things, then you would buy into NLP pretty easily. Because what it is that you gesture a certain way, or you nod a certain way, or make eye contact a certain way, and people are more receptive to your message by this neuro-linguistic programming. They start to believe you more by tricks of the hand, quite literally sleight of hand. Quite literally sleight of hand. Or the way you raise your eyebrows, it's really, you can go read about it on the internet, it's super weird.
And sometimes you hear of nonverbal communication, it's kind of the same thing. And they're like, women should use gestures of like bringing in, so that because people relate that with motherhood and you're being held together. So when you're talking and you're a woman, you should do these. But men should gesture outwards, because you want to characterize strength,
Yeah.
like you're fighting back. Men should never gesture in, they should only gesture out.
Yeah, all this stuff is still with us too. Like, you know, they tell police to like approach people and stand like this, like to communicate some kind of authority and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
It also communicates, according to them, impatience.
Yeah, they're like, hurry up, you know, this kind of like, what's the problem? Like, if you ever encountered a police officer, 9 times out of 10, they're like this. And this is how they're trained to do, because supposedly it has some kind of like persuasive advantage for them, or communicative advantage for them in some situations. So it's not as heavily believed as it was back then. Like back then, it was really believed that you could gesture in a certain way and people would just feel sad automatically. But this comes like modern day books, best-selling books like Nudge, a book about how to get social change without having to persuade people by using reasons, are bestsellers, right? The idea that if you make a list of things, people will generally choose the third option, means that you should put the healthier option third on the menu to make your citizens healthier, is like a great idea. Hey, more people are choosing the healthier option. This is great. But from the perspective of one point of view of rhetoric, it's horrific. Because you are denying people ethics and agency. The things that we would fight to defend democracy to preserve. So you're secretly making them do something that's good for them, without giving them the agency to say no, or to evaluate the reasons. These are the debates we're having now, which are the same kind of debates that they're having in the ancient world, and even in ancient Athens. Should you give people the tools to create the reality that they want us to share, or should we just not have those tools? Like the Republic, Plato's Republic. Who gets banned from the Republic? The poets, the painters, and the rhetoricians. They're not allowed to live there.
Troublemakers. Troublemakers.
Yeah, they're troublemakers. Why? Because they create non-real, hopeful, ideological images that distract people from looking into their souls for the truth. So no poetry, no painting, no Netflix. No, what's our modern poetry? I guess we still have modern poetry to this. Guy Ben Lerner wrote this great book
Called rap?
recently called The Hatred of Poetry.
It's called hip-hop.
Hip-hop, yeah, that's a good one.
Hey, so one of the interesting things, this summer I took a trip to Boston, and I was visiting Harvard, and I was meeting with this archivist, and I was like, what's that cage over there? And it was they had a little thing on it, you'd love it. I should have took a picture of it.
This is where they put the rhetoric professors on.
No, it was called the Elocutionary's Nest cage. And what happened was the students got into the cage, and the professor stood behind the student and attached these sticks. And then the student would then give the memorized speech, and then the professor would stand behind and make the gestures for the student like a puppet. Right, so that the student would know that when you make this kind of claim, you're supposed to put your hand out like this.
Yeah.
And then you're supposed to put your hand on your heart like this. And the professor would kind of move the student around like a puppet. Well, they gave this memorized speech. It
That's
was
pretty wild.
frightening.
Did you take a picture of this thing?
I wanted to, but I didn't have my smartphone yet.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Sam just got a smartphone. It's really. I saw him pull it out earlier. I've known him forever. I was like,
You almost
"Where's the
fainted.
flip phone, Sam?"
You almost fainted.
I flipped. I was like, "Are you stealing again?" I thought we took care of that. What would your parole officer say now? Do I have to report this? No, it's actually his phone. Pretty well. But yeah, this is the way people thought. The elocution. They were like, "This is what rhetoric is the movement, the style, the pacing. It's like blocking, how to do an accent." This is why a lot of times speech departments are associated with theater, even to this day.
Yeah.
My department, if I give you my business card, if you want it, you can have it. It says Rhetoric, Communication, and Theater. This is a throwback to the 1950s when my university was founded. And when they had their new campus, they started making these departments. That was what was going on at the time. This lasted a long time, and it's still with us. You can go and get books on public speaking at the bookstore from the business section. It'll be things like how to stand, your best impressions made in the first 15 seconds. How to gesture. You know, people think pointing is bad. That's why Bill Clinton always spoke like this. This kind of thing. So, there's all these strange things we tend to believe about it. But I think the redeeming thing about the elocutionary movement, if I could say one nice thing about it, is that we still believe rhetoric has a lot of power. It's just in our bodies and in our gestures. And there's a lot of people doing embodied rhetorics today, and other kinds of weird rhetorical theory that kind of is a gesture, pun intended, back to the elocutionary movement, of the idea that there's something about being in an embodied material condition as a human being that has real communicative impact. Allen Ginsberg always argued this about why Buddhism and Eastern mysticism was so important is because the syllable Om that a lot of Buddhist sects chant, they'll sit there and go Om, Om, and they're all sort of doing it. That has a harmonic effect on all of your cells and all of the atoms that make up you, to where you actually do become the same organism, because all of your atoms are vibrating at different pitches now. He believed that if you did this, everybody would be vibrating in the same level, and then communication would be easier. It would be easier to get your point of view across to other people. Allen Ginsberg really believed this. And this is, we could connect this to the elocutionary movement.
It's a
It's really quite a strong movement. It's still with us.
One other thing about the elocutionary movement, when everybody's heard of the Gettysburg Address, right? Well, Abraham Lincoln had been trained in the elocutionary movement. We don't have a film of Abraham Lincoln giving it, but eyewitness accounts are like, he made these awkward, weird gestures during the Gettysburg Address, because he had been taught, much by, probably self-taught by books like this, that Steve has a picture from, that he owns, where when you make this kind of statement, you must use this kind of gesture. When you're talking about the heart, you touch your heart. And so eyewitness accounts of Abraham Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address have him doing these weird elocutionary things, well, saying 70 years ago.
Yeah, he also had this very high-pitched voice, people say.
Yeah.
He would get really excited, and it would get to be this really, really high-pitched kind of
Falsetto.
intense.
Sort of thing.
It's not the way we think of this real gravitas, very
Yeah.
solemn, super duper bass voice that vibrates your coffee table. 70. It's not it's not like that. He was this kind of spindly. But I'm sure he was formally trained in this kind of stuff, at least in his younger school, if not college.
Yeah. He didn't really go to college.
Yeah, which is super interesting to think about what his schooling was like, or what he had access to.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Okay, so this is where we are in the 19th century. Is we have a pretty sad case for rhetoric. Rhetoric's been taken over by the master of the dark arts, Peter Ramus, and his ideas, and now all we have is this kind of sad gesturing. It's a similar situation to this. So we really need a hero. This is the end of case one. This idea of Aristotle's long and twisted reign over rhetoric is coming to an end, and it comes to the end with the usurping of the magic brought to us by Gorgias, and the really compelling pragmatic thoughts of Aristotle have been twisted and malformed into this. We need a hero to come and face the master of the dark arts.
Hey, before you go on, we've been going pretty long. It's 8:45. Why don't we take a short break so people can pee, and then find out about this gentleman.
So when we come back, good interruption. So when we come back, I'll talk to you about your very own Harry Potter here at Cornell, who turned it all around.
Nice.
When we come back. No, the first case is a long one because I just want to give you the trajectory of how people have thought about rhetoric as persuasion and this and that. But here at Cornell University, the revolution happened, the big change. And it was in the English department. This is Herbert Wilhelms, or Wilchelms. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Wilhelms.
Wilhelms. Sam would know. Herbert Wilhelms was an English professor here, and he wrote a very influential essay in which he talked about literary criticism. In English departments, literary criticism is the big daddy. That's the thing that's at the top of the heap. Literary critics are like the highest thought of people. Underneath that would be like the composition teachers. Underneath that would be the MFAs, and on down the line. It's unfortunate that they're not all seen as the same, but literary criticism was seen as the most amazing thing you could do as a professor, and he did a lot of that in the English department here. And then he started thinking, there's a lot of speeches these days in our country that people make decisions on about how to vote. I wonder if you could apply literary criticism to speeches. And I wonder what would happen if you did. Is there a sort of a Shakespeare of speech? Is there a Byron of speech? Is there a really great classic canon of speech that we could say? How can we evaluate speech? Most of the time it's just people's taste, right? I like this speaker, and I like that speaker. And a lot of times it's already because you're ideologically aligned with that person, right? So I have a lot of people who don't think, I know a lot of people who don't think Hillary Clinton's a very good speaker. I think she's a very good speaker. But they don't think she's a very good speaker because they're aligned with Bernie Sanders. They think Bernie Sanders is an excellent speaker. I don't think Bernie Sanders is that great. You know, it kind of reminds me of like one of my old great uncles or something. But I think Hillary Clinton's very polished and very together. But these are reasons why people say they don't like her. But it's ideological alignment. They don't like what she stands for, or who she is, or that she's against Bernie Sanders, right? Kind of thing. So Wilcox was identifying all of this back in his day, and he thought, I wonder if there's a way we could figure out if speeches were really good or not. Like a literary criticism of speech. So he wrote an essay in the 1920s called Towards the Literary Criticism of Oratory. And here's what he said. Rhetorical criticism is necessarily analytical. Throughout such a study, one must conceive of the public man as influencing the men of his own times by the power of his discourse. So he sort of set up this next idea that I'm going to bring to you about rhetoric being a critical tool or a hermeneutic tool or a heuristic. It's a way of looking at a text and deciding whether or not it is meaningful, what its meaning could be or is, and what the possible responses to that text are. Judgment. Like any good criticism is, what is this text about? How do we know? What's the evidence in the text that points us to that meaning? And then how do we judge it? Is it good or not? Just like a movie critic, right? There's this kind of thing. He thought of speeches as literature. And that's what he wanted to do. And he started an entire movement here at Cornell. It's called the Cornell School of Rhetoric. And the Cornellians were known as being, and here's the big plot twist, Neo-Aristotelians. They weren't Aristotle as we had in case 1, but they were Neo-Aristotelians. That means they're looking at Aristotle but under a new way. They, instead of seeing Aristotle as productive and creative, a way to teach people how to speak, which we saw from all the other stuff in the first half of the lecture, what the Cornellians, the Neo-Aristotelians, thought was Aristotle was really, really good to show people how to analyze political speeches and figure out if they were any good. And they used Aristotle's principles from the rhetoric as the scorecard to do that.
And just a little interesting thing. So the highest award one of the highest awards that you can get from the National Communication Association is called the Wilcox.
That's right.
And it's named after him.
He's seen as the founder of the field that I'm currently in, that I currently teach. Wilcox is seen as the founder of contemporary American rhetoric.
And here's another weird thing.
He's a Cornell professor.
It started here at Cornell, 1920s, 1930s. The guy taught at Cornell until he died in the 1960s. And there was this famous Cornell School of Rhetoric. It was well known all over the world. The weird thing about it, it didn't really exist. Wilcox just decided, I'm going to start this school. I'm not going to ask anybody's permission. I'm just going to, me and my buddies are just going to call it the Cornell School of Rhetoric. But it's not like, it doesn't have an office or anything.
Yeah, there's no building.
There's no building. We're just going to do this thing. And we're going to have workshops in the summertime that people that are interested in learning from us can come and we'll talk about rhetoric and what you should do. It was world famous. It was the place. Do you know what is left of it today?
This class.
This class. Only thing left. Wilkins things. Sad.
Sam is holding it together.
Hanging the fort.
For old
Sitting
Herb.
here in the cinder block like bomb shelter. Trying to hang on to the last bits of Wilkins' dream. We are the Cornell School of Rhetoric right now.
You even have to bring in like foreigners like me to
Yeah.
teach it. It's terrible.
Smuggle you in.
Yeah,
No one
it's
knows
like
you're here.
under cover of
Don't
darkness.
tell anyone.
I'm just the new groundskeeper. Okay.
Yeah.
Rhetoric.
Yeah.
I don't really know why it collapsed here. I really don't know
Because
why.
all the people, because we didn't institutionalize it. All the
Yeah.
people that taught it died.
Yeah, that's right.
Or
Yeah.
went away, and then they're like, oh, I guess it's gone.
But it's weird because like I'll go to a national or international conference today, and you still find people who identify themselves as Neo-Aristotelians. They're still out there. They're still doing this kind of work. It's the most basic thing you do. You take Aristotle's rhetoric, and you say, okay, how well did this person use Aristotle's modes of proof? So Aristotle had two different senses of what evidence was. Artistic proof and inartistic. Inartistic proof is something that you and I can go look at together. It's not dependent on me or you. We can go look at it together, like the laws or the results of the last Olympics or whatever Aristotle's pointing at. An oath said in the public square or something. I mean, Athens must have been smaller. Everyone just had one name. I guess if somebody swore an oath, everybody would know that it happened. This kind of thing. An artistic proof, Aristotle says, is something that the rhetor creates while they're speaking. This sense that you have, that I hope you have, if I'm doing a good job, that I know what I'm talking about, that I'm an expert. I provided you no external credentials. Just my words, just my performance up here. And if you have this,
for you.
yeah, Sam introduced me, so I invited him here. All these things were created by our words. This is an artistic proof. There's no external verification. But it's persuasive in the sense that you think I'm credible. This is ethos. Right? The sense a speaker is credible or has some kind of authority is worth listening to. Right? Emotion. If I make you feel something and that brings you to my side and say, rhetoric is really cool, rhetoric's important because of a feeling I gave you through my words, that's pathos. And if I present a reasonable argument that you think would make sense to anyone, not just based on your personal tastes, but you think if anyone heard it, they too would find it convincing, that's logos, logic, reason. Those are the three artistic proofs Aristotle identified. Wilhelms and the Neo-Aristotelians took this as a template, and they took every political speech they could find. Let's look at Wilson's speech. Let's look at, whoever, I'm trying to think of the guy's name, Coolidge, or let's look at the speech by,
Herbert Hoover.
yeah, Hoover, a chicken in every pot. I couldn't think of the name, but chicken. Herbert Hoover is such a weird, people should study him more. He was like an uber billionaire who became president. I know it sounds like a familiar story. The super rich guy became president, but his campaign slogan was a chicken in every pot. Which is weird to think about, but his whole campaign was, I'm going to eliminate poverty. That was what his campaign was. It's like, poverty will no longer exist in the United States. I can make it a reality. A chicken in every pot.
And then he was the president during the Depression.
Yeah, and then the Great Depression happened. It was like, no chicken, no pot for anyone. And then he was like, don't worry, business will save us. And everybody's like, are you kidding? We're all dying. And then FDR came into power. And he could have been like, God Emperor of the U.S. if he hadn't passed away, right? He would just keep getting elected and elected. Everybody thought he was like a great savior person, right? So, anyway, that's off the topic, but you can find a Neo-Aristotelians doing this work today.
We have a whole chapter in our book based on this dude's work.
Mhm.
Like there'll be a presentation later on the semester on Neo-Aristotelian thought.
And I have two books. I should have brought them. One is a book. I collect all these books about my field. I'm kind of a weirdo. I really like what I do. Not a lot of people like this. One book is called The Cornell School, and it's a collected book of all the essays written by the great Cornell rhetoric professors. And it's a really old book. It was published like in the 1950s or something. And I found this in a used bookstore in Pittsburgh somewhere. And then the other book is a book of essays inspired by Wilhelm's 1922 essay, Towards the Literary Criticism of Oratory, prepared as a gift for everyone who attended Wilhelm's retirement party in 1966. And there's a photo of him in there in the 1960s still looking fresh, but not as he still had it. He still had it. Just a little older, But he's still looking pretty fresh. He still had the fresh glasses, and he was up on the style, so it's good.
Nice.
But it's cool that I have this book, because it was a pretty rare book that was just kind of given out to people who came to his retirement about his influence. And it was all essays people had written about why was this essay so influential? Why does this essay matter so much? Two really cool books I have in my collection about
And
Wilhelm's.
like many that have come through these hallowed halls, completely forgotten at Cornell. Right? No one even remembers there was a Cornell School of Rhetoric.
Does he have like a
Let alone that
bench
this
or
dude was
anything?
like behind it.
Bookshelf?
He doesn't have anything.
No?
He doesn't even have a paperweight. He
That's
has
too bad.
nothing. Yeah.
Well, he's somebody you people still think about today in my field. He'll come up every so often.
I'm trying to raise money to build a statue of him.
That would be great.
Right now, the closest we have is a small bear. Over by the athletic.
That's better than what my university did. We're like trying to build school spirit, so they just spent all this money on a thing called a spirit rock. They just bought a rock. I can't believe I put a job that was on YouTube.
Yeah.
They bought a rock and painted it red, and they just put it on the campus like spirit rock. Go touch it for some spirit. I don't know. I'm like, we should debate this on
Whoever
campus.
sold them
Huh?
on that should come here and speak to us.
I don't know.
Like
Oh.
Clemson.
Like Clemson, is that where it comes from?
Well, like a lot of football teams do it. They have like
Spirit.
a
We don't have a
rock-
football team.
They have a rock that they touch before they walk out.
Well, like, we don't have a football team, so it's like cart before the horse. Maybe we should get the football team first and then the rock.
I'd like to go into the spirit rock business.
Yeah. But then they tell me, every club will be able to paint the spirit rock. And I'm like, debate? My debate club can paint the spirit
No,
rock?
that's a,
So what we would have agreed that we're going to paint on the spirit rock is, hi, my name is Dwayne. Dwayne Johnson. I think this would be really good. Yes? No?
You were gonna say something to Dora about Spirit
no, I
Rock?
was gonna say like my high school had one and like every team could, you gotta first like register it through like the school, but like every night or before a football game or for like a club like event, you could paint this, it was like a really large rock.
Yeah, we have a really large rock.
Like
I
a
haven't seen it
very
yet.
big rock, but you could paint on it, spray paint it, like.
Probably got the idea from your high school.
Maybe. But I guess trying to make this relevant, you could do a rhetorical analysis of the spirit rock. You really could. I'm going to show you how to do it because these are critical tools now. We're no longer interested in, I know it's kind of a weak, but I'll get there.
I liked it.
So, I'm going to give you now critical tools. We're no longer in the realm of the production of rhetoric, like how to make beautiful speeches, but how to tell if a speech is good and worth listening to, or whether it was a good speech or not. That's what Wilcox introduced, is this idea.
So you know how like there's something called a theater critic? Or there's a literary critic? Or there's even a film critic? What he did is basically take this idea and apply it to speech.
Yeah, so I'm just going to highlight, in the interest of time, because I want to have time for us to kind of discuss all these ideas kind of at the end. I'm going to kind of go a little bit faster than I normally would, because all these issues, all these things I'm bringing up, you can take individual rhetoric courses on. You could take a class in classical rhetoric, which is all the stuff we did the first hour. You can take a class in rhetorical criticism, which is sort of what I'm talking about now. You can then take a class in rhetorical theory, which is what I'll be talking about in a few minutes. So what is a Neo-Aristotelian? Analytical and critical approach. Not productive, not creative, but how do we figure out if the speech is good, like I've been saying. So two figures to know about that might come up in your rhetoric class is one of the earliest debates in rhetorical criticism that's still with us today. This is a debate from the 1960s. It's a debate between Lloyd Bitzer, there he is, and Richard Vatz. And this debate is about this question of how do we judge speeches that are in response to issues. So Lloyd Bitzer said that the way that we can figure out whether a speech needed to be given or not is we look at what he called the rhetorical situation. And the rhetorical situation is an event happens in the world that is traumatic, awesome, inspiring, it blows people away, or it panics people, and people want an accounting for it. They want an explanation for it. The rhetor, the speaker, then can see that this is a moment where speech is needed, where rhetoric is needed, and then comes up and addresses it in a way that helps people understand it, so that they can get on with their lives, so that it doesn't throw them into an existential crisis. So a big event happens, like today, September 11th. So 16 years ago, September 11th, 2001, was such a moment that Lloyd Bitzer would call the exigence of a rhetorical situation. We were attacked. We didn't know anything about it. President Bush that night gave a speech where he tried to address that exigence and to get people to understand what had happened and what the government was going to do about it so that things could go forward. That speech was written about from quite a Neo-Aristotelian rhetorical criticism point of view over and over and over again in my field. And in fact, in that speech, Bush clearly outlined one of the things that rhetoric is supposed to do. He says in that speech, what should Americans do? What can Americans do? We've been attacked. What does the government need from you? I ask you to live your lives. So this is exactly the kind of thing that good rhetoric is meant to do, is to get people to be able to go about their affairs and feel comfortable and feel like everything is okay. But he explicitly said it in that speech, which I think is kind of interesting. A lot of people criticize that speech, said he could have done better, but that's kind of the point of doing this kind of speech analysis. So for Bitzer, there are things that are exigences that call for a rhetorical response. So when we do this kind of analysis, we look to the exigence and whether or not the speaker addressed it properly. This is an event that everybody feels like it needs a speech about. Richard Vatz critiqued that. He said, actually, there are events happening all the time, all around us, that require rhetorical response. A good rhetor can make one of them more important than the other ones. There's not some event that requires it. That's also part of the art of speech, is to say this moment is the one to talk about. because the world is full of such ruptures all the time. So to say that something is outside of the speech, an exigence, is to get it wrong. That's also part of the speech too, is convincing the audience that this is worth addressing. So this debate about exigence, where it comes from, what are the limits of speech, is something that you should think about when you're defining rhetoric, when you're doing your rhetoric projects, is what are the limits? What counts as being criticized by speech or not? Right? You tell somebody, I love you, right? Should we do a persuasive analysis on that? Some people say yes, some people say no. Like, how deep does it go? How far does it expand? That's kind of the question that this debate sort of brings up. And people still go back and forth on this question. Richard Vatz is a Pitt alum, actually. Good place to get your Ph.D. in rhetoric, I think. So, well, I went there, so.
Where?
Pittsburgh, he's a Pitt alum.
Oh, that's where you went?
Yeah. So, there are three things to think about in terms of speech criticism, neo-Aristotelian criticism. And that is the audience, the proof, and the style. And these are categories that kind of come up in Aristotle. Actually, they come up quite a bit in Aristotle. He talks about all of these. But they change in neo-Aristotelianism. They change. So who is the audience? In speech criticism, in this second way of thinking about rhetoric as an analytical tool, the audience is not just who's actually there, but who the speaker believes to be there and who that audience imagines themselves to be. This is getting very deep very fast. So Edwin Black, who's another 1960s scholar, talked about the second persona and about how whenever you look to an audience and speak to an audience, you're not just speaking to the people who are there, but you're also speaking to their ideological belief of who they think they are. So I can talk about Americans in here. I can talk about all kinds of imagined relationships about who you think you are and who is connected to who. And that we're all, like earlier I talked about the Founding Fathers, we all feel connected to them in some way. This is the kind of thing where audiences aren't necessarily just who's there. It's also who are they ideologically constructed to think that they are. Proof. What are the things that count as proof or evidence? For some audiences, they don't need a lot of explanation on certain things. For others, they need a ton. Sometimes people will accept things that you think are facts as facts. Other times people will think of them as speculative. These are all things we have to be aware of. Did the rhetor use appropriate proof for that audience to get their point across? And then finally, the question of style. Did they speak in a way that that audience thought was appropriate? Not that there's a right way to speak to audiences. Some audiences require you to be a little off color. Some audiences will find you more believable if you swear or if you elide some of your words. I grew up in Texas, and so in Texas, fixin' has lots of different meanings. Right? I don't know if anybody's from Texas anymore, but it's like I'm about to is what it means. I'm fixing to go, but I could also be fixing lunch, but I'm fixing to go. Or I could be fixing a car, right? So things like that, fixing, things like that are part of style. Audiences really appreciate it if you speak in ways that they think are appropriate. Not right, not wrong, appropriate. And this is another big insight from rhetorical criticism that we get. For example, Aristotle had a great, I forget his name, but he had a very, very influential student who was really into this idea. And Athens was like New York City in that time. Every part you go to, there's a different accent. Just like if you go to New York City today, everybody speaks a little differently in what part of the city you're in, right? So I don't know if you've all been there or not, but if you go, you'll hear a lot of different accents. Long Island sounds a lot different than Brooklyn, sounds different than Bronx, etc. So what this guy did was he tried to master all the different Athenian accents. And as a test, he went to a woman sweeping her porch in the neighborhood where the Parthenon is or something. He was like, hey, I'm not from around here. Can you show me where the Parthenon is? And she was like, what kind of joke is this? What kind of trick are you playing? Obviously, you've grown up in this neighborhood with the way you're speaking to me. Why are you trying to cause trouble? So as presenting himself as a tourist in that neighborhood, using her neighborhood's accent, he actually made her angry. Because she was like, of course you know where it is. You grew up here speaking like that. And he was like, yes, mastered it. Because that's really what he was trying to get, was that authentic accent. I think it's kind of a cool story. I don't know if there are people who try to do accents and master them today, but it's the same kind of thing. But He thought it was really important for speech. Okay, so I should have replaced this meme with the, all you had to do was clap meme with Jeb looking really sad with like the nuclear explosion in the background. Have you seen that meme? It's like my new favorite. It's like all you had to do was clap.
Have you all seen that clip of Jeb Bush as he gives a speech and at the end he's like, everybody's just looking at him and he's like, please clap.
Good old low energy Jeb. That's like my favorite thing about Donald Trump is all the little names for everybody. Crying Chuck, Little Marco, Low Energy Jeb, Lion Ted. What are some of the other ones? I forget. Crooked Hillary. How could you forget Crooked Hillary? It's like action figures. You expect to go to like the Walgreens and find it's like, oh, they have this Crooked Hillary. I already have that one. I need Lion Ted to complete my collection. It's like Pokemon or something. But I love that. It's really kind of cool. And so a rhetorical critic could take all those names and say, how are these effective at constructing the kind of meaning that Trump wants? How do these work? Are these a part of political speech? Can we study them? And the answer is pretty clearly yes. This little guy, this is probably my favorite guy. He's the most revolutionary figure after Wilhelm's for the field of rhetoric. This is Kenneth Burke. Kenneth Burke was interested in the question of what goal does rhetoric have? Is the goal of rhetoric always to rationally and reasonably persuade people to do things? Because the Neo-Aristotelians kind of assumed it was. Like if someone gives a speech, they're trying to convince you that a policy is good. But maybe rhetoric has broader goals than that. What happens if we expand it beyond rational reason by Enlightenment standards, rational reasoned proof? What happens if we expand it? And he wrote a lot about this. Do people hear reasons and simply change their minds, or is something else happening? And Kenneth Burke said something else is happening. People don't just hear reasons and say, oh, I was wrong, and they change their minds. There's so many forces operating. And he came up with a theory to explain all of human activity in response called dramatism. So Kenneth Burke had no problem associating himself with other people who had written books that attempted to explain all of human interaction. People like Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. You know, small-time players who don't get referenced in every single field around every discipline all the time. So Kenneth Burke had a very healthy ego, right? He's like, dramatism. His theory of dramatism is that theater doesn't mirror life, life mirrors theater. We're all engaged in a play, and we're all engaged in expressing certain motives at certain times through performance that then people see and they have corresponding attitudes towards. So I display a motive to you and you say, oh, what's he after? What does he want? And after you figure out what that person wants, you're persuaded to have a certain attitude towards them. And that's Kenneth Burke's theory in a nutshell. Again, you could take an entire course on Kenneth Burke if you wanted to. I've done it. I highly recommend it. But I can't really get deeply into his ideas here tonight.
He was an interesting guy. He had a lot of weird quirks. He was a neo-Luddite.
Yeah.
He believed in technology. He had never graduated from college.
That's right. Autodidactic. He studied a lot in the New York Public Library. He was really good friends with the poet William Carlos Williams. He was like a poet in New Jersey. He wrote all these amazing. He wrote that poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, that you probably learned in high school. He was a doctor. But Kenneth Burke was really good friends with him, and good friends with all kinds of people. He wrote for The Dial, which is a journal that published Hannah Arendt and all these other people in the 1920s and 30s. So he was a music critic. He wrote all the time. He wrote all kinds of stuff, and he was a really crazy dude. And he lived a very, very long time. He died in 1993. So he lived to a very ripe old age, even though he's living on a farm without running water in New Jersey.
And he mowed his lawn with a pair of scissors. He's like,
did he really?
Yeah. This is like, he's like, who would use a contraption like a lawnmower? Like a push lawnmower.
Oh, wow.
He was against that.
It's too technical for him.
But the interesting thing about Kenneth Burke is, even to this day, there's a thing called the Kenneth Burke Society.
Yep.
He still has his devotees. Are you a card-carrying member?
I'm not. I subscribe to the listserv where people fight about how Burke would describe what Donald Trump is doing. That's what these emails are about. But I don't participate too much. But it's interesting to see what Burkeans are up to these days when they're looking at modern political sensibility. But the important thing for Burke is that he moved rhetoric away from persuasion to this idea of rhetoric as identification. So what is identification? He says rhetoric is all about this idea that we see people and we see things, symbols, that we would like to be more like. So we perform in ways that get other people to see us as part of that symbol. At the same time, while we're doing that, is we're pushing other symbolic associations away. So the red hat, we were talking about the Donald Trump hat. If you see somebody wearing that, that's an indicator that they want to be associated with Donald Trump and what he stands for, his movement, his politics, whatever. At the same time, they are dissociating from a lot of other political ideas, and your attitude towards that person, based on that identification, is going to, based on how you feel about Donald Trump, it's going to go one way or another. That's what he's talking about. This is what rhetoric is for him. He wrote a whole book called Rhetoric of Motives, where he outlines this definition. But he wrote a ton of different books, and they're all in your library. You can go check them out. I'm sure they're all there. They're like classics. But Kenneth Burke is one of these weird people whose books are not all in the same place. Some of his books are in history, some are in sociology, some are in philosophy. He's all over the place because he just kind of wrote eclectically. He had the advantage of not being formally trained as a scholar. So he's not stuck in a department, like a lot of us are. So, this is the third case, which is rhetoric as identification, or rhetoric as the way that we constitute the world. Rhetoric's no longer about reason, persuasion, and speech, whether it's bad or good or how to do it, but rhetoric is about how we constitute the thingness, the believability of our surroundings. And that's what Burke ushered in with his books. So this is rhetoric at its most broad, most all-consuming, most, enveloping, I guess we could say. So here are some of his ideas. Rhetoric is the realm of the subsidized lie. I think that's kind of a cool phrase. That's one of his definitions. He says rhetoric is the scramble, the realm of cloaked malice. Rhetoric is forever proving opposites. So it's something that's always working at cross purposes towards a clear meaning. It's something that helps something untrue, like a subsidy, become marketable. It has all these different functions that he says that it is. But most importantly, for him, rhetoric is the study of how humans make meaning. That's it. How do we make something mean or not? He actually has an essay called The Definition of Man. It's a sexist title, but he means humans. I think if you wrote it today, he'd say humans. But The Definition of Man, where he outlines what it is, and he says all these different things about how humans are rotten with perfection, and they're aware of their own death, and all these things. So it's his outline of how we are the symbol-using and abusing animals. We are kind of trapped by symbols. It's not like we choose to make symbols. We require them. We're kind of their prisoners. We're always moving in their orbits and out of their orbits is the way Burke saw things. Rhetoric is identification and practice. We're constantly trying to get people to see us as we imagine ourselves to be. Consubstantiality is his word for this. We want to be consubstantial with the things, the people, the ideas that we think are awesome. So we're always trying to symbolically associate ourselves, verbally associate ourselves, physically, whatever we say, with the things that we would like to be. We want to be consubstantial with them. We express our motives in the world along those lines. Like whenever you meet somebody at a party, you kind of go through this. You're like, hey, what kind of music do you like? Who do you listen to? And then from there, you start to make different judgments about where this person fits in your world. Are they consubstantial with the things you like or not? How close or how far away are they? From determining someone's motive, what it is that makes them tick, then we know what attitude we should have about them. And in theater, this happens all the time. A character comes early in the play, and they say what they want, or in musical theater, they call this the I Want song. So the main character comes out, they sing their I Want song, and then we kind of know what they're about. Right? And then we can say, so now we know how we're supposed to feel about them. Until the dramatic situation changes and they reassess, and then we feel a different way about them. This is our attitude. And theater is always getting us to express different attitudes by showing, misdirecting, revealing, and hiding the motives of different characters. And Burke said this is how the world works. Theater is not a reflection of this. Theater is the world. That's what he said. So, what can we do with that? Well, we can certainly use it to analyze things that we wouldn't think of as traditional rhetoric. Like this. Here's an example of something rhetoricians talk about today. This image. Everybody's familiar with this? This is still a hot issue. This was a hot issue last year when I gave the same lecture. This was still happening, right? This is still a hot issue. So, what does this image mean?
depends who you ask.
Hmm?
It depends who you ask.
Yes, it depends on who you ask. There's tons of different meanings here. I mean, yeah, that's a good answer, but you know what it means to you, you look at it, what a rhetorician would do is look at it and say, okay, now why am I pulling that meaning out of there? What parts of that image are doing that for me? When Colin Kaepernick does this, what's he trying to identify with? What's he trying to divide from? Burke says, anytime you identify, you're simultaneously dividing. So there's always side effects to whatever it is you're doing. This goes back to sort of the Gorgias drug idea, right? You take a drug, there's always side effects. Like Burke is the first person to kind of like, he didn't say this, but this is a connection that I've made thinking about this, is anytime I'm trying to identify and say, yes, I am in support of hardworking families, I'm immediately identifying with whatever you think the term hardworking families. What's the motive of saying that? Oh, this is what he really means. This is the attitude we should have about that politician. When people see Colin Kaepernick do this, they're saying, oh, look at what he's disrespecting. Look how terrible he is. And they're also saying, wow, look at the risk he's taking. Look how brave he is. All these things are simultaneously true. Rhetoric isn't about getting to what's true about it, but how people are ascribing motives to Colin Kaepernick. And how those motives create the reality around us. So rhetoric isn't for people who are looking for enlightenment questions, like, what's the truth revealed about the world? Okay, we're done with that, next puzzle. Rhetoric is constantly, rhetoric is forever proving opposites. So we're always returning to the same things again and again and again to talk about perspective and meaning and how it changes and how people are always moving around to do these variant things. So, from Burke we get a number of different things that modern rhetoricians study. One is called the rhetoric of inquiry, which is how are different academic fields structured persuasively to make you think that they're accessing the truth. So one is the rhetoric of science. Here's DNA, right? DNA does not look like this. This is what we think it looks like. There's no photo of DNA. But this is an incredibly persuasive image of what it has to look like based upon the evidence of how the chemicals interact. Watson and Crick are very, very, very famous for having come up with this double helix image, which now we associate 100% with DNA. We think DNA looks like that, which means we are persuaded to think DNA looks like that. As far as what DNA looks like, we have no idea. But this is what it probably looks like, right? Brain imaging, right? All these colors are added in by a radiologist afterwards. The original image is just shades of gray. This measures blood flow to different areas of the brain. We think it means that different thinking is happening. We're persuaded by science to do that. This is the rhetoric of science, and it's something you can study. Here's Copernicus fighting with a monk about, no, this isn't the Earth, really. I didn't make it, no, please don't get me in trouble. This is the kind of thing that rhetoricians of science look at, is how science persuades us to think that it's describing reality, truth, absolute fact. There's plenty of people writing about rhetoric of science. If you want citations, I can give you if you're curious about reading about it. But some of my friends do this work, and it's really fascinating how we have valorized scientists as sort of like the new priests. They're the ones who have access to truth and meaning about the world. You know, people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, people like that, who everybody thinks are like, their wisdom is just as good in politics as it is in astronomy. Right? And there's absolutely no problem with them moving back and forth. It's totally fascinating that people believe that. Whereas you wouldn't believe that about your car mechanic, for example. Even though your car mechanic has an expertise that would be equivalent to Neil deGrasse Tyson's knowledge of astronomy, yeah? They know everything about the car, he knows everything about that. Why doesn't it work both ways? It's interesting to me, I think. Also, historiography and history. The idea that historians access what really happened. How is that constructed, persuaded for us to believe in that way? So, rhetoric of inquiry. How these scientific and not so scientific methods communicate truth, facts, authenticity to us. How do they do that? How are they so good at doing that? And that's what rhetoricians in this study. The other thing is space, place, and memory, which is very popular. I don't know a lot about it. But what it is everything from how a museum is laid out persuasively by curators to make you think you're accessing this painter's life as it unfolds through their work. That's a persuasive move. That's a move that constitutes a reality for you. It's rhetorical. When you go to a museum and you walk through and it shows you the work about the period and what's going on, all of that was selected to create a case of why this artist is important. And curators fight and fight and fight about it. One of the biggest museum fights in American history was the fight about the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan at the end of World War II. When that plane was going to be put on display, what should be put around it? What does this plane mean? And there's a huge fight about what images should be shown around this and what story should be told about the role of this plane in American history, whether it's something to condemn or praise, or somewhere in the middle. What's the narrative? What should we be showing people? Because the awareness is that when you walk into a space like this, you're walking into an objective space of truth. A lot of people think. So it's very, very, very dangerous stuff that you're playing with. Rhetoric is often very dangerous like this. I think it's kind of...
Just one quick thing on that. So the Johnson Museum, which is our art museum on campus, wants to project the thought that they have these huge holdings of amazing things that they can pull out at any time. And so do you know how they decided to project that idea in the Johnson Museum? I'll tell you. What they do is they have this room, it's a display, it's down in the basement, and it's called the storage display. And it's supposed to be just random stuff that they have in storage that they decided to put in these cases. They're not in any rhyme or reason, but there's like a samurai suit of armor, there's a suit of armor from like medieval England, there's all kinds of masterpieces and weird pottery and Tiffany lamps, and they're like, here is a little bit of a slice of what we have in storage. And the idea is when you go, and it's in the basement, when you go down there and you see this, you go, holy shit. This place has so many amazing treasures that this is just a tiny bit of it. What an amazing museum. They must just have amazing stuff. The reality is, I've been here 20 years, they have rarely changed what they have inside that display, because they very hand-picked exactly what is in there to get you to drop your jaw, but they don't actually have enough samurai suits of armor to have a whole display on it. But if they act like they do, by just having this storage display, you think it's an illusion that, wow, this is an amazing place. I think it works brilliantly.
Yeah, they do that at Metropolitan Museum of Art too. They have the open storage. I think you may have seen that. Like the open storage or whatever.
Yeah,
So
that's what it's
cool.
called. Yeah.
Yeah. You can get lost in there. It's like, whoa. It's kind of like having somebody over and be like, oh, here's my place. I haven't really cleaned it. And you've just left out conveniently the things that you want people to see to think you're cool.
Yeah. And they have like Picassos and
Yeah.
stuff in ours, and we're like, oh yeah, that old Picasso.
You're like, wow, stellar physics.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, that's just on the coffee table all the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's casual reading. Or like some people will put certain books in their bathroom to communicate a certain, ethos, right? So, I don't know. I think some of you are giving me looks like you're getting ideas from this. This is meant to be descriptive, not prescriptive. Anyway, rhetoric is a dangerous thing. It's like teaching chemistry or something, but we use all the toxic chemicals. And I'm like, oh yeah, better use eye protection. Too late. Okay. Also, public memorials. This is a big one. So, big public memorials. This is the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. An amateur artist won this as an open national competition of what it should look like. It's interesting to go study about how it was determined to memorialize the war that we lost. There's another war we lost, the Korean War, which is memorialized with soldiers. And then there was a big controversial movement to also do a Vietnam memorial where it shows soldiers in the field, to which the original artist is very, very much opposed, and there's a big public debate about that, because these are not objective, neutral places either. This is how we communicate our history, what we stand for, who we are as a people. These are the biggest debates that you can get involved in terms of national identity and stuff. And what rhetoricians look at in this is, how do we communicate a sense of objective history while also loss and admiration and the appropriate kinds of feelings? How do you design that? How do you get that to work? Here's the Korean War memorial here. So you can go to Washington, D.C. and look at these things, and people write a lot about these things. The King Memorial was very controversial as well. A lot of people have written about that. Is that really communicating the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. that we want? And what choices were made, and how are those political, and all that sort of thing. So lots of people study this as rhetoric as well.
Just another quick Cornell reference. What's the most famous, iconic thing at Cornell?
Isn't it the bear? No, I'm just kidding.
I would say it's clock tower, right? And you get that. What is a big tower with clock on it? Ivory tower, right? Ringing a bell. Do you think that was by accident that they did that? No, there's a whole snobbery that comes away with that we have this amazing tall, ancient-looking tower with a bell in it, and it's supposed to represent everything Cornell and the Ivy League stand for. That tower. They couldn't have picked a better one. If you wanted to be an elite Ivy League university, that's the image you go for.
Yeah, all these things can be studied. Rhetoric is really open right now. What a time to be alive. Study rhetoric. So visual rhetoric, one of the last things I'll talk about today, is the study of how visual images convey how we should feel, think, believe, or be moved about things. So here are three very famous images the rhetoricians dealt with. This is called Napalm Girl, and it's an image of napalm has just been dropped on this village back here. These children have been affected by it. This girl has had all of her clothes burned off by it, and she has burns on her body. And the American soldiers are kind of like, he's having a smoke. They're just kind of like another day in the office. So when this image ran, how did people read it? How did it change sentiment about Vietnam War? What does it mean? And it's what we call an iconic photograph. In fact, this girl survived. She's an American citizen, and this photo just had an anniversary, and they interviewed this woman about this experience. You can go watch it on the internet. Be like, do you remember this day? What do you think about that? What do you think about America and Vietnam and all that? And so, really interesting what she had to say, but they showed her the photo. And that's also another way these things communicate. In the Great Depression, the federal government created an entire bureau of people to go out and photograph the Depression and archive it. One of the most famous photographers is Dorothea Lange, right, Sam? So this is one of her photos, and this photo has been cropped in a number of different ways to indicate what the Depression meant. But the point of this in the government's idea was what? To create what? What were they trying to do? Historically chronicle? Create propaganda? What were they trying to do? Maybe all of it. But you can look at these images and try to see how they try to communicate a message and what it is that people are supposed to mean. Or are we supposed to identify? Who are we supposed to identify with? What are we supposed to identify with if we look at it from a Burkean point of view? Or what are we supposed to divide from? What's the argument? Over here, this is a photo called Ground Zero Spirit. Very timely that I put this in here today. This was snapped by an AP photographer during the Ground Zero cleanup. And it's 3 firefighters raising an American flag on the site of these are first responders. This has just happened. And in the background, you can see here a gesture towards Iwo Jima that somebody has put in there. So this picture has been compared with raising the flag on Iwo Jima Island, which is another iconic photograph, and actually a video of soldiers doing that in the Pacific Islands in World War II. So raising this flag, Ground Zero Spirit. What is this meant to identify with? What is this meant to be? How do people make meaning out of this? That's what visual rhetoric scholars look at. And there's a big controversy about whether or not images can function as arguments. And there's lots of good arguments for and against whether or not they can function as arguments. Can images provide reasons? So, we've come to the end. You've seen the creative, productive art of rhetoric, the long story, ancient Athens, to the 20th century. Herbert Wilhelms, Cornell professor, your new personal hero, who changed rhetoric from productive art to a critical one to where we can look at texts produced and say, is it good? Should we agree with it? And then we have the third turn, which is sort of the Burkean modern turn that Wilhelms made possible, which is almost anything has rhetorical dimensions. As we move around, this room has rhetorical dimensions. It is structured, no accident, to look like a classroom. We might think about what is a classroom and how is it structured to look that way, and why are all the desks facing a certain way, and what does that communicate? All these things are things you can talk about in terms of rhetoric. So those are the 3 cases. Now we'll return to your definition. What is rhetoric? What do you think it is? How would you change your definition? Would you alter it at all? Or what questions do you have?